Hi, 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 and hey, hey, and welcome to Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles video cast. This is a live broadcast right now from the Fest for Beatle fans, and this program is all about the solo careers of the Beatles. I'm Ken Michaels, one of the regular co-hosts, being joined by Kid O'Toole and Tom Hunyadi. And we have a very special guest to bring on for you. He was the last lead guitarist in Wings. He was on the big hits of Goodnight Tonight and the number one song in America, Coming Up, live at Glasgow. On the Back to the Egg album, he was also part of the UK tour of Wings at the end of 1979. Let's have a nice fest welcome for Laurence Juber.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let's start with for those fans who are unaware of how it all started for you, how you came to join Wings.
Well, I was a studio musician in London, and in the course of doing that work, I was playing lead guitar on a TV show with David Essex, September 1977. And Denny Lane was a guest on the show, and we did Go Now, his signature tune from the Moody Blues, and he liked my playing. And apparently a couple of days later, he called up the musical director and said, "Is he versatile?" So, but I didn't hear anything. It wasn't an instant thing. I mean, that was September. I ran into Denny, Paul, and Linda at Air Studios a couple of months later, where they were mixing the sound for the Oriental Nightfish animation. And I was early for a session. They were running late, and so they invited me in, and I got introduced. And it wasn't until April of '78 that I actually got the call. I was doing a session at Abbey Road Studio 2, the most iconic studio in London, and there was a phone call for me, which was really unusual. Of course, this is way before cell phones or any of that. And I'd never been up the staircase. And I went up the stairs and went into the control room, and it was, quadrant faders, the old school way of doing things. And I took the phone call, and it was Paul's office saying, Denny wants to know if you can come and jam on Monday. And, oh, by the way, Paul and Linda will be there, which panicked me a little bit because I didn't know any Wings tunes. So I borrowed some LPs from my brother, realized that over the weekend I wasn't going to really be able to kind of figure out what we were going to play. So I decided I would wing it, excuse the expression. And we jammed on some reggae grooves and some Chuck Berry tunes, and then they offered me the gig. Well, Paul said, "What are you doing for the next few years?" And like my brain kind of like in that a nanosecond of, okay, I'm giving up this studio career that I've spent the last 10 years developing. And I said, well, I guess I'm playing with you. So, I couldn't turn down the opportunity to play with Paul. So
obviously.
And there it was.
Can you give us a quick rundown, if you could, of just a few of the recordings that you made as a studio musician prior to Wings?
Well, I played on the soundtrack of The Spy Who Loved Me. The first thing you hear in the movie score is a solo Stratocaster playing the Bond theme, and that was me. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know it for many years, but when we were recording, we did both the soundtrack and the album at the same time. And when we were recording, I had played on a version of Nobody Does It Better that was just Marvin Hamlish on the piano and a string orchestra and a sax player. And on that session, they said, "Oh, we need some guitar licks on this." And they ran, about a couple of minutes worth of a track by me, and I played some licks and then forgot all about it. And then it was pointed out to me not that long ago that was actually the Carly Simon record. Wow. So I didn't know I was on it. I played on Tales of Mystery and Imagination for Alan Parsons' project, which, as far as I knew, was a Tuesday night session at Abbey Road with a string orchestra, some mandolins, and Francis Monkman from Curved Air on harpsichord. And I forgot all about it. And they never put my name on the credits of the LP. So it wasn't until 25 years later, I was reading a magazine, and Alan Parsons said, "Yeah, we had Laurence Juber play guitar." We did. So that was, that was kind of an interesting thing, but that was all in a day's work. I was doing 3-4 sessions a day at that time.
Yeah.
My first big session was for a Cleo Lane album that George Martin was producing. So the first real record producer I worked with was George Martin, and I was pretty green at the time, but it was an education. A lot of stuff in England that never really made it kind of across the Atlantic, but I did work on an interesting record that Cat Stevens produced for his brother. And I also worked on a record that Jerry Rafferty produced for his brother. So, there's kind of like, kind of one step removed, a lot of things. But it was, it was a busy time for me. I did a lot of TV stuff. I did a lot of jingle sessions, 8 o'clock in the morning, you go and show up at Olympic to do a jingle session and then have to be at Trident by 10 o'clock, schlepping 4 guitars and an amplifier and trying to find somewhere to park and make it in time for the downbeat. I mean, it was an interesting time, and I'm glad I was in my 20s when I did it, because I'd never do that now.
So you proved to be very versatile.
Well, I set out to be versatile because I fell in love with music. Beyond the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles were obviously, I started playing guitar in November of '63. I mean, it was right after the Royal Command performance. So the Beatles and the Stones and, all the English bands. And of course, on the electric guitar side, Clapton and Hendrix and Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck. And, those were big influences. But I was also a big fan of folk guitar. Because 1963 was also, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and a little later, Paul Simon. And I loved the self-sufficiency of the folk guitar players, that they could just sit there with an acoustic guitar and nothing else. But when I was 14, a friend of mine and I had a duo, and we would open at a local folk club for Al Stewart and Martin Carthy, people like that. And then, 30 years later, I end up producing Al Stewart's records.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's fast forward to Paul. If I remember correctly, you told me many years ago the first session you were on was for same time next year?
May 5th, 1978. And I know that because I just looked it up, because my social media manager wants to post something about that song. That was a demo that he did for the movie of the same name. Right. He didn't actually get the score. I think Marvin Hamlish ironically got it. But I had never worked on a demo that was so well produced. Right. I mean, they put a 60-piece string orchestra on it. And that was just, that was kind of my introduction to being in the studio with Paul. But that went very smoothly. That record ended, that song ended up being a bonus track on the Put It There CD single and the 12-inch single. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about Back to the Egg and the initial sessions. And we all know Chris Thomas co-produced it with Paul, and Chris goes all the way back to the days at EMI, the White Album, working on Helter Skelter and songs like that. Was the plan all along for this to be a very hard-edged punk album? Because we all know Spin It On is punkish, and Old Siamser, To You, certain songs like that really have an edge to it. Or was the album really without a direction, because it turned out to be so varied?
Well, I think there was certainly the intention of it being a harder edged record, at least to begin with. And I think that, Chris was brought in because Paul had a new record deal, for one thing. He'd signed with Columbia Records. And of course, Chris, not only having had the experience of being George Martin's assistant, but also had, worked on Dark Side of the Moon and Procol Harum and Roxy Music. And he was bringing a different sensibility to the project. And the first batch of songs were indeed, more rock and roll. And I think the first thing we recorded was To You. Certainly in that first batch, it was To You, Spin It On, Old Siamser. And I think that as the album progressed, the softer songs kind of worked in there, but it was still, I mean, Rockestra, we started in July of '78 up in Scotland. And then in in September, we went to Lim Castle, which is a medieval castle. And of course, you know, when you're in a medieval castle, you have to make a rock and roll record. It's kind of rock and roll, you know. Yeah. And then we moved over to Abbey Road, and the first thing we did at Abbey Road on October 3rd of '78 was the Rockestra session. And, you know, having John Bonham and Kenny Jones, as well as Steve Holley, and the guitar section of Pete Townsend, Dave Gilmour, Denny Lane, Hank Marvin, and me, and Jimmy Page's amplifier. He never showed up, but his amplifier showed up for a while, and then it went away.
That must have blown you away, just having all those musicians in one
forget
room.
it. I mean, they just, from my perspective as a fan, you know, here I am playing with people that I idolize, you know, that I grew up listening to, but it was, you know, it was my gig, so there I was. So, you know, it was very exciting. It was challenging, but it was, you know, at the end of the day, it was all in the day's work, you know. As a professional musician, which was always my ambition, was to be a professional guitar player, you know, and to make music as a guitar player.
Right. Okay, we're going to rotate here with questions, and I think Kit, you're next.
Well, before getting into some specific tracks and Back to the Egg, I've told these guys I've been waiting to ask you this question for a long time. So I'm very excited about this. So about Good Night Tonight, which of course recorded around the same time. That flamenco guitar solo, I just love, and I just wanted to ask you for so long, was that your idea? How did that come about?
Well, thank you for that. We were working on the track, and we were in the basement of Paul's office in Soho Square, 1 Soho Square, London. And it wasn't really a real studio. It was, you know, we were in there to mix, but somehow we ended up recording. We did Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, and then we moved on to working on Good Night Tonight. And there was a gap. And it's, well, what should we put there? Well, how about an acoustic guitar solo, you know, just to change the texture. And I said, well, I don't have an acoustic guitar with me. And so I borrowed Denny's. He had an Ovation Adamus. And they ran the track by me, and I played something. And I said, well, you know, that kind of thing. And they said, exactly that kind of thing. I mean, that was one take.
Wow.
Yeah,
really?
that just kind of, it just spilled out. I was just in the musical moment.
My gosh.
Yeah.
I'm
glad it was, mind you, because otherwise it would have gone on for a long time.
I mean, where did you learn to play that style?
Oh, you know, it was when I was a teenager, and I would go, like, there was a local band leader that would take me out on corporate gigs and weddings and stuff. And, you know, they would play like Spanish Eyes, you know, that song.
Yeah, sure.
And I do like these little Spanish fills in there. And I'd listen to flamenco guitar, but you know, my right hand was never that aggressive as a fingerstyle player, but you know, playing with the pick, and it just kind of tossed it out. I mean,
wow.
Which is the best kind of thing, really.
Okay, that's it. Just kidding. Yeah, drop mic. Yep, that's that just absolutely was like the cherry on top for me for that song. So I've always wanted to ask you that. So, that's wonderful. So back to the sessions. So what was the atmosphere like in the studio? Was it a collaborative kind of spirit? I mean, what was it like? Like I've heard Old Siam Sir, for example, was a kind of a collaborative, kind of atmosphere. What was it like?
Well, it was definitely, I mean, Paul was really encouraging us to think of it as being a band and not just his backup. With Old Siam Sir in particular, we had been jamming on that song before we started recording the album. We had spent 3 weeks, somewhere around the end of May of '78, up in Scotland, just getting to know each other and just kind of playing through some of the material. And part of that, the instrumental section in Old Siam Sir was actually based on a chord progression that Steve Holley was playing. I think Linda might have even been playing drums when we were jamming on it, and and Paul playing guitar. And it just, there were certain things that just kind of emerged in the process. So there was collaboration. There was a lot of freedom, when it came, for example, to the guitar solo on To You, that was, you know, I was kind of basically left to, you know, kind of my own devices, except that Paul and Chris Thomas had decided that they were going to run my guitar through an Eventide harmonizer. You might think of it as kind of a very, very primitive version of auto tune, as far as you could change the pitch. So Paul was in the control room, and didn't matter what note I played, he would just be manually changing the pitch of it at the same time as you would hear what I was actually playing. And so I had no real idea as to what was going to come out. I just was going for something that was a little outside the box too. I think, which was in keeping of the kind of feeling of wanting to make it not quite so conventional. And that was very much a kind of a synergistic thing there. And then when with Spin It On, I was sitting in the control room, like with Paul right next to me, just eyeball to eyeball. And that was really the moment that I really understood how he functioned as a producer and musical director, in terms of he brought stuff out of me that I didn't know I could do. You know, and that was, I think that was a great insight for me, was that it isn't just kind of pulling stuff out of your box of guitar licks, but it's really going into something deeper, a different dimension. So there was that kind of collaboration in that. And there was also, I mean, there was room to bring stuff in. There was room to bring songs in. Now, you know, we were there one day. Linda was off with James, and Paul said, "Well, anybody got anything?" Denny, we'd already worked on Denny's again and again and again. And I said, "Well, I got this little instrumental, kind of like a Chuck Berry, Chet Atkins kind of style thing." And so Paul said, "Well, let's record it." So we did. There was a tune of mine called Maisie. And we just sat around in a circle with, you know, kind of Denny on harmonica, Paul on bass, and Steve on drums, and recorded it quite quickly. And, you know, it didn't make it to the album, but I've released it, you know, so. But the cool thing is that was my first composition, and I have Paul McCartney playing bass on it. So.
Not a bad way to start. But the thing that I'm sure many of us here love about the album is its diversity, and Baby's Request is one of my favorites, and I love your guitar on that. And I just wondered, you know, who your influence was. I've been trying to think if it was Wes Montgomery or you know.
Yeah, Barney Kessel in particular.
Okay.
Yeah, I listened to Barney Kessel, Joe Pass, Wes Montgomery.
Pass, sure.
Yeah, but I go to Ronnie Scott's club and sit in the front row and watch Barney Kessel's fingers and Joe Pass it. You know, and then 3 o'clock in the morning, I go home after smoking through a whole pack of cigarettes and then practice. You know, because I get there at 9:30, I could get in for £2 with a student union card. So whenever the jazz guitar players were there, I would go. But I think, you know, maybe channeling Barney Kessel for Baby's Request. But that was, I mean, that was a demo that we were doing for the Mills Brothers, because Paul had seen them in France when he was on holiday there. And he wanted to offer them this song. So we recorded it. And then apparently I think they wanted to be paid to record it or something weird. He said, "Well, we'll just do it ourselves." But a little kind of aside on that, there's a mini Moog solo on that. And I thought that, you know, a trombone would be really cool. And it just happened that day that in studio, I think it was in Studio One, Don Lasher, who was the greatest trombone player in England, was there doing a session. I said, "Couldn't we get him in and do it?" Well, no, I think I'll do it myself on the Moog, you know, which is that sense of self-sufficiency, you know. But, you know, that went down pretty quickly also. I mean, there's, you know, again, you just set up and you play the song, and at some point you get a take.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's just amazing how it just seems like it came about fairly quickly and just flowed.
Well, I think that, you know, it's when you have the right level of musicianship, which clearly was there, then if you know what the material is, you know, if you really, you've got the chords down and you've got the character of it, then it kind of develops on its own. You know, it's interesting in the Get Back documentary because they're writing as well as they're arranging. And, you know, so the arc, the creative arc is a different one.
Yeah,
Like that.
absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to pass this on. Keep going around.
Thanks again for being here, LJ. I want to talk a little bit about the Back to the Egg TV special, but before that, the track "Did We Meet Somewhere Here Before?" Do you have any knowledge how that got into the Rock and Roll High School film?
I have no idea. I think that, I mean, well, you know, MPL, Paul's company, is, I don't know if it still is, but at the time was, I think, the biggest independent music publisher in the world.
Right.
And when you're a music publisher, you know, you have people whose job it is to try what they call synchronization licenses, because that can be a very lucrative use of a recording.
Right.
You know, you get something in a movie or a TV show, and you know, it becomes a piece of business.
Right.
And so I imagine that's how that happened.
Because it just feels so out of place in that film. But,
Well, yeah, I discovered, actually, I didn't even know until I saw it on Wikipedia that the Same Time Next Year is actually used as the end credit in an Anne Margaret film.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't know.
That's great. So can we assume that while you're recording the Back to the Egg, that's when the thought, the idea came for the TV show as well, the TV special?
I expect so. I mean, I think that, you know, this is prior to MTV. But of course, you know, Paul had a history of doing promo videos. And I believe that the special, when it was broadcast, was sponsored by Coca-Cola. So someone made a deal, you know, and not long before I joined the band, Paul's management had changed. There was a man named Brian Brolly who was managing, who had a background in movies. And I'm sure that, you know, again, the business people were kind of, you know, looking for angles. He had a new record company with Columbia, and there was no plan for a US tour to back up the album. I mean, and we didn't even tour England until later on that year. The main promotional thrust was me and Steve Holly going around Europe and going to New York and, you know, being the new Wings, which was very exciting for us. So we filmed, must have been somewhere around May, that we filmed, because the album was done. And then we went back to Lim Castle to film all that stuff, including the aircraft hangar and all that. Then, you know, the next thing I heard was it was being broadcast in the States, but I think that didn't even get broadcast until later in the year.
Right. You know, I watched it again this morning, and it seems like you guys are having a lot of fun with that, especially out in the field, doing again and again. You know, you're doing your solo, and then behind you with the flowers.
Yeah.
And
I was just trying my best not to trip over weeds.
Right. It seemed like if you had allergies, that'd be somebody's worst nightmare in that field.
Yeah.
You know, but I mean, was a lot of that first takes, or did you guys know what you were doing ahead of time? We've just kind of got put in those situations. The first video we did was for Good Night Tonight. And that was an interesting one because that was done at the Hammersmith Palais, which is a big dance hall in West London that I used to go. I played there weekends with a man named Ken McIntosh, had a big band. And that was one of my kind of like just out of college gigs. And it had the revolving stage. So at the end of the set, the stage would revolve and the relief band would come on. And so, you know, you see it at the end of the video that you see the stage revolving, and I kind of waved to the camera. But that was fun because we got to jam and we had the crew as our audience. You know, and same thing happened when we were in the aircraft hangar doing Spin It On, you know, just those opportunities to play as a band for a small group of people, as opposed to, you know, the formality of a tour performance. Any of them stand out to you as favorites
in terms of the songs?
Of the videos.
Well, the Spin It On was kind of fun,
Yeah.
You know, although we had this huge bank of lights behind us, and we're wearing like fur-lined sheepskin.
Did you get to keep those?
I did, and then I outgrew it. but after the filming, I mean, I hung it up and it was literally dripping. It was so hot.
Right.
Yeah.
That's funny. A couple tracks that didn't make the album, songs like Cage, Robber's Ball, Boil Crisis, Cruising Ahead.
Well, Boil Crisis was a demo. We never worked on that.
Okay.
So it wasn't in contention.
Mm-hmm.
Cruising Ahead, I'm doubtful
Mm-hmm.
about that one because I don't think it's me on that. I don't remember that song
Right.
at
Okay.
all. And I know that comes up as a potential Back to the Egg outtake.
Mm-hmm.
It might have been jamming during the time we were back at Limcastle.
Okay.
But it wasn't part of the album.
Okay.
Nor was Rubber's Ball.
Right.
Rubber's Ball was when we went back to Limcastle.
Okay.
And we just had a day, one of the setup days. And that started life where I was at the studio, in the castle, and I was just kind of noodling. And then Paul walked in, sat down at the drums, and we just started jamming, and they ran the tape. And then we built the track from that. I should really get songwriting credit.
You should.
And that was, and the other tune we did when we were in that, because we had the Rack Mobile there while we were doing the video, was Weep for Love, Dennis'
Okay.
song.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
What about Cage?
Oh, Cage, yes. Well, Cage was one that we did work on a lot.
Okay.
I have a couple of memories of that. One was miking up Paul's Rolls Royce to get the sound of the horn, which they ended up didn't work, so they used a mini moog to do that. And then when we were working on it at Abbey Road, we wanted to do that kind of calliope section. So we had bottles of whiskey. And of course, you blow across the top of the bottle and you get a pitch. So in order to change the pitch, we had to drink the whiskey.
Right.
So we were all a little bit loopy by the time we got done.
Nice. I believe that summer McCartney also records What Becomes McCartney 2.
Right.
Were you aware of this? And
Oh, yeah.
Was there any thought in your mind going, okay, well, maybe our jobs are in jeopardy now?
I didn't really think of it like that.
Okay.
I mean, for me, being in the band was such a gift that it was like, it wasn't, and I knew that, there was no incarnation of Wings that lasted more than 2-3 years anyway.
True. Yeah.
So it was something that was going on. I knew that Paul had a multi-album deal with Columbia.
Okay.
And, once it was done and we started working on the repertoire for the tour, coming up, became a Wings tune too. So but I think that and from my perspective there was the dichotomy between where Paul was going as a solo artist and where the band was going. There was a divergence there because you just have to compare the two versions of Coming Up.
Right. That's true. And Denny was really wanted to get out and tour more than I think probably
and
Paul
Denny started doing solo gigs
that's right.
that summer. He and Steve Holly were playing. I went to see them at a couple of pub gigs.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
But I was busy. Paul had asked me to record an album of stuff out of his music publishing catalog, which became my Standard Time record. So I was busy during that summer, kind of into pre-production for doing that.
Gotcha.
So when we were mixing that record, we would do like all night mixing sessions at Air, and then I'd have to go, rehearse all day for, with Wings. So it was an interesting period.
Right.
Yeah.
Ken?
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question that I've asked you a lot through the years, but it's kind of important for me to bring this out because every now and then I'll always hear people say Wings was just Paul's backup group, or they were a vehicle for him to tour. How do you respond to that? And what distinction do you make between a Wings recording and a solo recording?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it was Paul's backup group because he was the boss. But we were encouraged to treat it as a band. And he gave us enough leeway that it felt like a band. So that was really, but it wasn't just Paul's band also. I mean, it was Linda, the reason for Wings to even exist was because Paul wanted to work with Linda, which is why he would never do Wings again after Linda had passed. He said very specifically, that it just wouldn't work for him. And I understand that. But it was very much, it felt like a band. And, and there wasn't a lot of touring going on, by that time, by that point in the 70s, they had moved out of London. They had got the kids settled in school. They, Linda didn't want to do another world tour. She has 4 kids to deal with, including baby James. And it was getting to be, a lot for her. And so, and you can see, it really was kind of, I look at it as the Indian summer of Wings. It was kind of like, the last phase of it. And as I say, for me, it was all a gift, just the opportunity to work with Paul to get that kind of an education, from McCartney University, as it were. And so, but it was all those things, it's like the Beatles were a pop group, a rock group, a folk group, they were everything. And Wings, had its phases and it had its facets. And so I enjoyed it as being in a band.
But at the same
he
time,
was still writing the checks.
After the UK tour, there were plans, of course, to play in Japan, and I would imagine to play the US, to go beyond that.
Well, more than plans to play in Japan. I mean, we were there.
I know that, but
I was standing here, and he was there when
Right.
when half a pound of weed, suddenly materialized in a suitcase. So that, that really kind of put a crimp in the touring plans, because I imagine that we may very well have done some US dates, and that would have coincided with having a #1 record. So that was kind of a shame that it went that way. But it also, I think, was kind of indicative of the fact that there was just this, Paul and Linda couldn't be living the same rock and roll lifestyle that they'd been living 5 years earlier. It was just the times were changing, to quote Dylan. We were moving out of the 70s into the 80s. And when we did the Kampuchea concert, for example, you had this wonderful mix of, you had the Who and Queen and Wings, very much representing the 70s, but then you had the Pretenders, for example, and Elvis Costello. And it was kind of a changing of the guard in a way.
Interesting. Yeah. How do you think Paul felt doing that UK tour? Do you think that was there anything that maybe you observed that maybe he felt this might be the end of the road for Wings? Was he going through the motions, or was he really excited about the tour?
I don't think he was going through the motions, because musically, I mean, he was singing great. His bass playing, especially using the Yamaha bass, which he had been given shortly before that tour. Well, actually, right before we did the videos, his bass playing is extremely robust, and it was a very solid. The core of the band was really solid, but I think that it was just it was starting to become just not compatible with the kind of lifestyle and the kind of direction. Wings, our Wings, really at its best was a rock band. But Paul's busy writing, Average Person, and songs like that. So when we came later on in 1980, when we came to start rehearsing the Tug of War material, which from my perspective were songs that would have been better worked out in a studio environment rather than in a rehearsal hall, because they needed those kind of, whether it would be an acoustic guitar texture or something, stuff that comes easily in the studio, but you're really just kind of discussing when you're in that kind of environment. And so it was really, there was a divergence, and clearly Paul's heart was with the family and with Linda and with the kind of pop direction. And of course, again, having this big record deal with Columbia, which was a very valuable deal for him, because part of it was he got the CBS songs catalog. So he got Grease, Chorus Line, and Annie, all of which got made into movies within a year of him getting that catalog. So nice. The business hat was an important factor there. So it was just Wings had really just kind of run its course creatively, because of the direction that he was going in. And I saw the writing on the wall there. So I was already making plans to move to New York, which I did right after we did the last Wings sessions in January of '81, where we worked on, for example, they did a remix of Same Time Next Year. We did, what was it, Love for You? I put some slide guitar on that, and there were a number of like quote cold cuts that we were working on, and then I moved to New York. Actually, it was a shame. There were two occasions when Tony Visconti, who called me in December of '79, saying, "Oh, you want to come to Switzerland and do a record with Rick Wakeman over New Year's?" And so I went to Paul and said, do you mind if I do this? And he said, "No, go ahead." And then the next day he said, "Well, I really want this to kind of be perceived as a band, so you shouldn't really be doing that kind of studio work." So that was good. And then the day as I was getting ready to leave, I went to visit them at Air, and there's a phone call for me from Tony Visconti. "I'm doing a Mary Hopkin record. You want to come play on it?" I said, "Sorry, Tony." So, because I did sessions for him in London, in my session work days. But I moved to New York, and I'd only been there a couple of months when I met Hope. I mean, Wings officially folded April 27th of '81, and I met Hope April 28th. So there you go. Yeah, it was destiny.
One of the most popular bootlegs out there is the Last Flight bootleg. And from what I remember, Jeff Emmerich was asked to mix it.
Well,
so
Jeff recorded it too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So why didn't that end up getting released at the time? Do you know?
I think it could have been part of the Columbia deal. But I think that from my perspective, I mean, we were just getting going. I mean, that was the last night of the tour, and we did have a release. I mean, coming up came from that same concert. Sure. I think that we were changing the repertoire for Japan. So there would have been Live and Let Die, Another Day, which had been a big hit in Japan. Let 'Em In. There were some changes. We were swapping tunes out. And I think that had we continued to tour, there would have been more live recording and a live album potentially culled from that. But I just, for me, it was, I mean, it's cool stuff. It's cool recordings. And I think the version of Good Night Tonight on that is particularly good. And his vocal on Old Siam Sir, I think is better than the one on Back to the Egg. And he's right at the very top of his range. I mean, it's not like he was not putting, heart and soul into it and calluses and everything else. It was all really, he was in a very good musical space there.
Yeah. Did the band have anything to do with the selection of material live? Because the '79 tour, he's actually starting to bring back more Beatles songs instead of just the 5 during Wings Over America.
Yeah. We did actually, at one point, we looked at Things We Said Today, but that didn't make the list. We also, I mean, we played around with A Little Luck, but it just didn't fit. Again, because the band had more of a rock edge to it.
Okay.
And that was theaters. I mean, we did Wembley Arena. We did what, 3-4 nights? I forget how many we did there. So we were playing for large and small audiences in that on that tour. And I think that it kind of got distilled down to that particular list. But we opened with Got to Get You Into My Life.
Right.
But I think that what part of the motivation for that was that Earth, Wind and Fire had a hit with it.
Right.
And Paul wanted to kind of, I think, it's my tune.
Okay. Yeah. He also did, you did Fool on the Hill. And
we did Fool on the Hill.
Let It Be, which ironically wasn't done in the Wings Over America tour.
Yeah, no, and that one was particularly dear to my heart because I got an opportunity to do my own solo on that.
Right.
Because it wasn't like there was the definitive Beatles solo.
Okay. Yeah. One more question. Do you think that Wings, you kind of answered this question. Should Wings be put into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as an entity to itself? I know Paul's already in there for post-Beatles work, but do you think that that's a mistake? It should be kept separate.
Oh, I don't know. I'll have to ask Steve.
Still Paul, we haven't done a Paul yet, right?
I played with him last week. So,
Uh-huh.
yeah. But, you know, I mean, Steve has his opinions about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yes,
Yeah.
we know.
But I think that, I mean, it would be lovely were that the case. And certainly Wings had its own identity, separate from the Beatles and separate from Paul's later work.
Mhm.
So there would be some justification for it. But there's a very long list of very worthy artists that aren't in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Sure.
And some that, you know, maybe aren't really rock and roll at all that are in. So, you know, they make their decisions, I guess, on the, you know, whatever. But it would be really an interesting thing if we did get it. You know,
Yeah.
well, that would be lovely.
A lot of fans find a big distinction between Wings and the solo music.
Yeah.
So certainly
you
more
know-
presence from Linda vocally.
Well,
And of
that's
course,
true,
you know,
yeah.
Denny Lane all throughout the whole history.
Yeah.
You know, and the fourth and fifth
But
members.
Denny's in there with the Moody's. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, it's, I mean, when you really start getting into the granular detail of the history of rock, I mean, is like Burt Burns in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
No,
Is Phil Spector in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
he has
Well,
to be.
how come Phil Spector's in and Burt Burns isn't, when Burt Burns was more influential than Phil Spector, for example? You know, and so I think there's still, you know, there's niches that have to be filled, and Wings certainly would be worthy, but I'm not holding my breath.
Mhm. Okay.
Going back to the egg, I'm sure I speak for everybody in here through, you know, saying that, you know, we love the album, and, you know, as we all know, when it first came out, I mean, it did well. I mean, it was a top 10 album, but, you know, critics weren't, you know, were more divided on it. But over the years, I think a lot of people have come around on it, and we certainly all appreciate it. Why do you think that Back to the Egg has grown in stature over time? Why do you think?
Because it's a good album.
Well, that, yes.
And you can't always trust critics.
Yeah.
you know.
Mhm.
And yes, it was not that well received by the critics
Yeah.
at the time, but the fans loved it.
Mhm.
I think commercially it would have benefited from Good Night Tonight being on it, because
I
that was
agree.
the hit.
I agree.
And I think that was a little bit to the record label's chagrin that Paul wouldn't put it on the album. But it's a good album, and it holds up. And that's the thing that I find interesting, because, you know, in making records, from my experience, there's something that I refer to as shelf life.
Mhm.
You know, when you make a record and then it sounds great at the time, and then like a year later, it's like, maybe it's not as, you know, quite what I thought it was then. Not necessarily referring to my own stuff, of course. But I think that album, Back to the Egg, has really held up.
Mhm.
And it, to me, listening to it, you know, as I do once in a while when I need to refresh my memory about
Yeah.
something, it still sounds fresh,
Mhm.
which is quite remarkable. Because, you know, and, you know, in the digital era, you know, it was very much an analog record. One of the last records really that was purely analog out of Paul's catalog, because I think that by the time they got into doing some of the early 80s stuff, they were already working in digital format.
Right. Mhm.
Because it has that analog kind of warmth to it. And I think that the songwriting is interesting. It's, you know, I always wondered about the My Salamander line.
Yeah.
And then I realized that a salamander is actually, there are multiple meanings to it. And a salamander is like those kind of like little bursts of flame that you get in a fire. They're called salamanders. And it had something to do with Linda being referred to as a salamander in her youth. So I think, you know, people kind of sometimes get the wrong idea
Yeah.
about things. But, you know, an album that has Rockestra and Baby's Request and To You on it is, you know, kind of stylistically is not easily pigeonholed.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I think that that made a difference too. Also, just strictly from a business point of view, it took a long time for Capitol Records to really understand how to market Wings. You know, I mean, it was only because an edited version of Jet was released to radio that Band on the Run really started to get its real traction. And I think that Columbia didn't, they just, I think there was an assumption that Paul would be self-marketing in that respect. You also are coming out, it came out on the back of Rumors, Saturday Night Fever, albums that were selling huge quantities. You know, pretty much the week that Back to the Egg came out, the US economy went slammed into a recession. So there were a lot of factors involved, but it was still a successful album. And it was still a platinum record. And this, at least, you know, Good Night Tonight was a top 10 single. The singles that were drawn from the album, I think that in particular, Arrow Through Me was,
love that.
you know, and that could have, I mean, that song could have been produced in a more Wings-like way, as opposed to, in a sense, kind of looking forward to McCartney 2 by being as stripped down as it was. But I remember being at Abbey Road and Paul Simon came in to listen, and he just kind of stood there aghast at how big the bottom end was when there was no bass on that. There's no bass on that track. It's just the left hand of a Fender Rhodes. So, you know, less is more. In that kind of context. So, and that tune in particular is very popular.
I love it.
You know, our daughter Ilse is a songwriter, Grammy nominated songwriter. Fingers crossed for tomorrow. And, you know, she's walked into writing sessions where there are, you know, songwriters listening to Back to the Egg and that track in particular, because it's become quite iconic. In fact, Erykah Badu, you know, I didn't know until I got a reuse check from the Musicians Union, you know, that she used the intro as a loop for a recording. Yes, so I think that there are aspects to all of that you know still resonate, and that's gratifying to me because it was good work. We did good work, and it is appreciated certainly by the fans, and it seems to come up as one of the top 3 Wings albums. So thank you very much.
Absolutely right. Hear, hear. And thank you for addressing the salamander thing. So Good Night Tonight and salamander. I mean, I'm done.
Any other questions?
Yeah, let's talk about you're offering new music here while you're at the fest. Let's talk about what you got.
I am. Well, I've got 2 albums because my the Fab Fourth, which is my 4th album of solo acoustic Beatle arrangements, was due to be debuted at the Beatle Fest that was
2 years ago.
2 years ago,
2020.
Yeah, which never happened.
Right.
So that's really kind of fresh.
Right.
But also during lockdown, I started doing what I call Tea Time with LJ, which initially was 5 days a week. Actually, sometimes more because you know sometimes there'd be a Sunday Beatle Fest thing or something. But I distilled it down to 3 days a week: Moody Monday, Workshop Wednesday, and Fingerbuster Friday. Occasionally Fab Friday.
Right.
And I would dig deep into my own repertoire. I would do arrangement, you know, play arrangements of Beatle tunes or, you know, anything that was kind of in the repertoire, but also if it was a particular birthday, if it was a certain songwriter's birthday, or when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and I discovered that she was a huge opera fan, I did an arrangement of Puccini's Nissan Dorma, you know, which was really a challenge. I mean, but I was an opportunity for me to really kind of push myself.
Right.
And it became kind of a full-time job because, you know, coming up with 30 minutes of material 3 times a week with stuff that I maybe hadn't played at all before.
Right.
I mean, the first cut on the album, which I've distilled from that, which is called Select Blends, you know, as in kind of blends of tea. The first cut is Within You, Without You, which I had only played twice, once on a Beatle Fest celebration for George. I think it was for George. Oh, it might have been, yeah, for George, that's right. And then, no, the one that's on the album was for George's birthday, and I'd done it prior to that. But that was just something that it was just kind of a personal challenge,
Right.
you know, to find a way of making that work as a solo acoustic guitar piece. And so half the album is covers, half of it is originals. I did Pleasant Valley Sunday because it was Carole King's birthday, and I'm a Monkees fan, and I'm friends with Mickey, so that was kind of, and it's a very cool tune.
Right.
But I didn't realize that that cool guitar lick that it starts off with was actually Mike Nesmith. I thought it was one of the Wrecking Crew guys like Louis Shelton, but it was actually Mike Nesmith. So that's what I call a virtually live album, because it was live, but there were no people. It was not in computer parlance meet space. It was cyberspace. So there was an audience, but they weren't in the room.
Right. So both of those you're presenting here for fans to buy this weekend.
Yeah, and if you get the select blends, you also get a little tea time with LJ Pidd.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure I can say for everyone, but during that whole pandemic while you're playing live, I mean, it was really just like refreshing, and just, you know, seeing people out there performing for people that were stuck at home, and you know, it was really a great gesture on your part, and really appreciate you doing that.
Thank you, and it just felt necessary. You know, I wasn't just going to sit at home and you know, do nothing. You know, and it was just the motivation to play, and then to also wrestle with the technology, to, you know, figure out how to get the best sound and the best video, and which platform to use. And in the course of it, I did a few things on Bandcamp, which, you know, I can actually make money doing it on Bandcamp because you can charge for tickets. On Facebook, you know, people can give you stars, but, you know, it's like, it's not that effective. But on Facebook, for all of its faults, for the social interaction of it, that you can, you know, somebody posts a comment, somebody can respond to that comment like within the nesting of the comment, whereas on Bandcamp or YouTube, it's very one-dimensional. I did look at Twitch, and it didn't quite work for me, but I still have a Twitch page. And that actually could relate to the fact that I've composed for video games in the past, but yeah, that's a bridge too far. I mean, I really, for me, the focus is on my repertoire and my following, my cyber following.
Right. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here. Anybody else? Any more questions?
We take questions from the audience. Anyone have any questions for Laurence?
Well, let me. Okay.
Right here.
Favorite memory of the 79 tour is actually, my favorite memory is when we were doing the Campuchia concert. And at the end of our wing set, we had the whole orchestra on stage. And we did Lucille, and we did Rockestra theme, and we did Let It Be. And I'm on stage with Pete Townsend and, you know, all these luminaries, you know, rock royalty. And it comes to the solo, and I look around and nobody's going to step forward. So you know, and I was used to doing it. So I get to step forward, and I'm on stage with all these people, and I'm on stage with Paul McCartney playing Let It Be. And I'm in, you know, kind of guitarist heaven. And then I smell brandy fumes. And there's Pete Townsend kind of, you know, leering over my shoulder. So to pay him back, you know, at the end of the set, I put the top hat on him, and he just threw it out into the audience because he wouldn't wear the silver lame jackets that we had. That's my favorite memory of all of that. But before I finish, I want to just bring up a couple of things. You know, our daughter Ilse is a songwriter. She's nominated for 2 Grammys right now. She had a co-write with Lil Nas X and Elton John from the Lil Nas X album. But more importantly, she wrote All My Favorite Songs for Weezer, which is nominated in the Best Rock Song category, and her competition is Paul McCartney. Paul found that amusing. And then and she also wrote Panic at the Disco's High Hopes is one of hers. Shawn Mendes' Mercy. She wrote the last 2 songs that Chester sang with Linkin Park, recorded with Linkin Park. She really has done remarkably well. And if you go to Ilse, just Google ILSEY, Ilse, and her Wikipedia page has, you know, a lengthy discography. In fact, on Spotify, they have these written by playlists. And I accidentally stumbled upon her written by playlist. 15 minutes later, I'm still scrolling through it because she's done so much stuff. Miley Cyrus, she wrote Nothing Breaks Like a Heart. But the cool thing was when Miley did that with Mark Ronson on Saturday Night Live, the second song that they did, because it was a Christmas show, was Happy Christmas, War Is Over, with Sean Lennon. So she got to work with Sean. How cool is that? Yeah. And then our eldest daughter, Nico, quit her corporate job a couple of years ago and wrote a musical, which she just did a reading of in New York a couple of days ago, doing a performance at 54 Below, Feinstein's 54 Below on Monday night. And so our kids are creatives, and then Hope and I work together. She produces my records. I wouldn't have done the Beatle albums were it not for her insisting that I do. And we're in development on a very Brady musical, Brady Bunch musical, which she co-wrote the book with her brother Lloyd, and then we wrote the score together. And she had a comedy rock and roll band called the Housewives back in the day. And then after the Trump election, she turned it political and put together the Nasty Housewives with our friend Marcy Levy, who wrote Lay Down Sally with Eric Clapton. She's in that. So, you can, and there are videos of that whole album. If you go to thenastyhousewives.com, make sure you put the in. And we live the life of creatives. I mean, after Wings, I became a studio musician again in LA and played on hundreds, thousands of TV shows. Home Improvement, Roseanne, 11 years of a show called Seventh Heaven. Very prominent acoustic guitar on that. In fact, I'm just getting ready with Dan Folliott, who was the composer of that show. We're going to be releasing an album of music from that because there's some really, really cool stuff on it. And it's just a good listen, and then I started putting out these solo acoustic records, and I think like the latest one may be number 30. I lost count, and somewhere along the way I produced 4 albums for Al Stewart and toured with him. Right now, this week's project, I have a friend, Richard T-Bear, who's a songwriter, kind of in the kind of Leon Russell, Dr. John kind of area. And we've been gigging around LA. In fact, for a while, we had Denny Sywell playing drums with us. Now, Tony Braunagel, who's Blues Drummer of the Year, Taj Mahal's producer, he and I just produced a record called Red Harvest, which is about what's going on in Ukraine. And it's going to be, kind of a charity fundraising release. And that was mastered yesterday. And so that should be out within a few weeks. A very interesting song. And Richard has amazingly, because he was also starting to do kind of Facebook Live stuff called the Bearcat, is his one on Facebook. And somehow in this kind of crucible of being forced to be self-reliant, he has gone into this really amazing kind of area of writing really compelling lyrics. And so we're putting an album together around his work. So that's kind of an ongoing project. And then I've got a whole bunch of material I want to record for another solo record, and just, playing a lot more electric guitar. Now I do also, and you'll hear, at the fest tonight, some of my revisiting the Wings repertoire. I do, but Paul won't let us use the name Wings, just to avoid confusion. So I call it airfoil. And I've done a few. We did Abbey Road on the River, and I worked with Peter Asher's band doing that. Jeff Allen Ross, and they know all the tunes, so it makes it easy. We don't have to rehearse very much. I have a few copies of my book, Guitar with Wings, and that's all the pictures I took during the Back to the Egg sessions and around that period. And it's my biography too. So yeah. So there you go.
One more thing about Ilse, didn't she co-write a few songs with Harry Styles?
Oh yeah, she wrote Treat People with Kindness off the Fine Line album, which I played on. Phone rings. Daddy, what are you doing this afternoon? And I said, well, I'm free. So, well, we need guitar. So, and Harry Styles is a big Wings fan and a big fan of Back to the Egg too. And so I went to East West Studios, and Jeff Baskett was the producer and played, kind of almost like a coming up type rhythm part on it. But all that guitar on that record is me. So, and they did a really cool video to it as well. So very exciting. Not often that I get to work on something that else is written. There was a J-Lo track very early on in her career that I played on, but this was a union gig too. So can't complain about that.
And Harry's also performed Wonderful Christmas Time.
I imagine so. Yeah. Cause he's just a fan of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's how it goes, because there's this generations of musicians that grew up listening to Back to the Egg. And, for some people, people have told me that's how they got to the Beatles. Right. Was through Back to the Egg. And, so
we bring this up all the time. A lot of people were exposed to the Beatles first from their solo music. Yeah.
So there you go.
So this is one very talented family, the Juber family. Apart from all the great music that they've done, we should also say a very happy 40th anniversary to Hope and Laurence from a few days ago. And I guess we should just wrap it up.
Yep.
Laurence, this has been tremendous. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And he has a table out in the lobby for his stuff.
Yeah, I'll be in an hour or so. I'll be out there. Oh, lovely. Sure.